Okay, and now I am share screening. Hello, everyone. Let me put this on slideshow. Okay, so welcome everyone. I hope you enjoyed my references and were able to see some of them. And a lot of the information I'm going to be covering was already done on that. This time, I think, we'll have everybody be able to unmute themselves because I'm going to do some pauses for us to ask you some questions and have you ask me some questions. But as we go along still, if you have some questions, please put them in the chat and then we'll be able to talk about them at the end. Okay? So if you can all mute yourself now, I think that would be good. Okay, so the topic today is Northern Californian women artists. And I put up here a picture. This is actually a Texas woman artist, but I thought it was just such a good picture. And it looks like she's got wings on in the back there. This is from about 1890. There are so many artists I could talk about and so little time, but I'll only be able to touch on some of the most influential or well-known artists of the period. Those who were well received at the time and who have been, for the most part, forgotten or only recently rediscovered. I wanted to start with a little bit about how the Bay Area, particularly, and how San Francisco and Northern California developed at this time. The American population of California really begins with the gold rush of 1849. At that time, the population of San Francisco was about 1,000. So it was essentially just a Mexican garrison town. There were women in the gold fields from the beginning, as you can see in this daguerreotype. And the photo on the right is by one of the female photographers that we'll be talking about in that lecture, Eliza Withington. Mostly they were there in roles as they ran boarding houses or were providing restaurants and that kind of thing, or as the article was talking about that I had on that list for you, there were lots who came as sex workers. By 1850, California's population had increased to 110,000 men and only 10,000 women. That was enough of a population that the state became a full-fledged state in 1850. By 1852, women's numbers had doubled to 20,000, but men had gained another 70,000. That was in 2 years. So this lopsided ratio of male to female continued until near parity in 1930. Between 1870 and 1880, the population doubled in the Bay Area, accompanied by a concerted push to establish cultural institutions. And as we talked about last time, the instigators for most of these developments were women, most of them from prosperous, affluent, well-to-do families, often associated with the railroad barons that had really brought all of this prosperity to the region. Despite predictable societal strictures about gender and race, San Francisco's unique demographic development caused a more culturally diverse, more ethnically varied society than in other more settled parts of the country. And I include here just a classic artist photo. This is Annie Harmon at her easel. She was one of the many who came from an affluent family, had studied with William Keith, and goes on to have a somewhat interesting career. Now, the only reason I put her up here is because that's such a classic picture, but also because she was, her works were bought by one Texas woman who, she collected all of her works. And a friend of mine who knew her got her in touch with me so that I would write about her. So I wrote that Annie Harmon entry in Wikipedia. And she managed also to get an exhibition of her works at St. Mary's College, which is in Moraga, which has the major collection of William Keith's work. So we had a kind of conference there about Annie Harmon and two other of the women artists. The other picture is of Woodward's Gardens gallery from the 1880s. Woodward's Gardens was kind of an early amusement park, an early theme park, which was quite beloved in San Francisco. And I think it continued into the 1910s, 1920s. And you can see that they were interested already in bringing artworks to San Francisco. It was easier in California, given this demographic mix, for anyone with talent to succeed. This is not to say there wasn't racism or there wasn't discrimination, but if you had talent and you had the ability to get some training, it was easier for anyone to become well known. And I give an example here of Pauline Powell, an African-American daughter of a Pullman porter born in Oakland. She was a descendant of Thomas Jefferson's famous slave family, the Hemmings. She showed early talent as a musician, a pianist and singer, and she was the first African-American to perform in the state to rave reviews. But she took up painting as well, and her works were shown at the Mechanics Institute in 1890. She seemed to have been self-taught, although she would have gained entrance to San Francisco art schools if she could have afforded it. The art institutions were from the beginning open to all, including women, and even the Chinese could attend. And this is in an era of vehement anti-Chinese sentiment. So this is just to give an example that it was a very different environment in this new society than was operating back east at the time. One of the most influential, oh dear, now where is it? Okay, it's not going to do it. One of the most influential and intriguing artists of the early years was the outlier of all outliers, who became one of the most popular American artists of the late 19th century. And this was Grace Carpenter Hudson. Grace was born in 1869 in Ukiah, that's in Mendocino County, which at that time, in the late 1860s, was still open country, home to of the Pomo Indian tribes, with only a few Anglo settlers. Grace's parents were well educated from Vermont, from abolitionist background, and they came out to the West to be involved in the work with local Pomoan groups. They started to collect baskets and to work with the Pomoan tribes. These are some of the baskets which are still, that were collected by her family and by Grace as well, by of the Pomoans that are now in the museum. The museum is in Ukiah, and these are superb early examples of Pomo baskets. Grace was encouraged in her artistic talents and also participated herself in collecting native baskets and was very close to many of the people of the tribe that were nearby. She was very independent and had gone on her own at only 17 to San Francisco for art training. And in the summers, she worked in her father's photography studio. She married her second husband, Dr. John Hudson, in 1890. She had first been married against her parents' wishes to a much older man, and that had ended, surprisingly to me, in divorce, which was unheard of at the time. As Grace became increasingly prosperous through her artwork, the doctor, Dr. Hudson, left his practice to concentrate with Grace on ethnographic studies of the local tribes. Now, as with so many well-meaning and what were considered progressive people, Anglo families at the time, the Hudsons genuinely believed that the native population was dying out and sought to capture as much of their traditions as they could. They were early friends with Grace Nicholson. Grace Nicholson, if you know Pasadena, the Pacific Asia Museum used to be Grace Nicholson's house, and she was one of the early collectors of Indian baskets, and you'll find her collections all over the country. So they knew each other and established a kind of business relationship at that time. As we can see from these photos, Grace Hudson was the epitome of the new woman in California, independent, a bit bohemian, for the time quite liberal, and in a modern marriage where she was the main breadwinner. She also saw herself as an artist who intended to make a living from her art, and she became a quite savvy businesswoman as well. Together, the Hudsons built the Sun House, which is still there and part of the museum, and began this collecting, and often had evenings, sort of cultural evenings, in which they had speeches given about the ethnographic studies that her husband had been doing, and many of the Pomo Indians became regular visitors there as well. So she was well placed to take advantage of the national interest in all things Indian in the 1890s. The piece on the left, National Thorn from 1891, was one of the first of her pieces to be exhibited in San Francisco, and it caused quite a sensation. The title, National Thorn, refers indignantly to the idea of the time that the Indian question was a thorn in the nation's side. But the painting that really established her reputation nationally was the one on the right. This is Little Mendocino, exhibited at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which Grace Hudson actually attended, and she had more works than this one exhibited there as well. This particular piece is the one that was the subject of that article that I sent you. It caused a sensation, probably the most widely copied painting and reproduced painting of the time. It fit into all the right categories for a woman painter: a child, a baby, an animal, a sentimental depiction of a native scene. Most of her paintings were done with a model or from photos, and they're all in these rather dark tones, but ethnographically as realistic as she could make them. So she's actually using the implements of the tribes that she knew, and they're always in these dark tones. Now, the painting on the right, the Back to Her Tribe, this is the only time that Hudson actually made a kind of political stand. And I'm reading here the description of this painting that's in the catalog from the Crocker Art Museum, where it is. Quote, "This painting depicts Josepha Dick," and that's Josepha over on the right, "a well-known Pomo basket weaver. Josepha and her husband had one son, Billy. In 1898, the year Hudson painted this work, Billy, then almost a teenager, was forcibly taken to Chemawa Indian School in Oregon. Hudson and her husband, friends of Josepha, tried to intervene on her behalf, but were unsuccessful. While at the school, Billy contracted tuberculosis. He died in California in 1901. Giuseppa died 4 years later. So she was deeply involved with these people. By the late 1920s and into the Depression years of the 30s, interest in Hudson's Indian paintings and in her style of painting had waned significantly. And in letters to Grace Nicholson, who was then the leading gallerist in Pasadena, Hudson expresses her dismay over the lack of sales. Nicholson commiserates and blames, I love this, so-called modern art as playing a villainous part. Hudson even tried her hand at crafts and writing based on Pomo stories that she hoped would appeal to a younger audience. And I found these pictures and the letter in doing some research at the Huntington Library in Grace Nicholson's papers, including these weird little bunny dioramas that Grace Hudson made. But there was no market during the Depression for luxury goods such as this. But one of her last letters to Nicholson, the one I have here, laments what she calls the passing of the true Pomas. And she says, the touch of civilization cannot be hidden. They cannot go backwards any more than we can. So again, this idea that the true Indian culture is over at this point. More central to the self-conscious development of a Californian aesthetic style within modern art directions is the artist couple, Arthur and Lucia Matthews. And I want you to notice her. She's dressed in a Renaissance outfit, which will give you an idea of their romantic connection to past culture. Arthur came as a child to San Francisco from a family of architects. Arthur studied in San Francisco and then in France and became the director of San Francisco School of Design in 1890. He was responsible for changing the school's curriculum into a more modern approach to art, focusing on life drawing classes and outdoor painting. And in 1894, he married one of his students, and this is Lucia Kleinhans. Lucia was born in San Francisco, and before her artistic studies, went to Mills College. And Mills was one of the leading advocates in the state for women's higher education. When the Matthews married, they went on a long trip to Europe, where Lucia was able to work in the atelier of Whistler, James McNeill Whistler, along with many California women. Apparently, because Whistler was American, I guess, many women went to France and studied in his studio or in at his school. So there was a whole group of what were called the Californian girls. Whistler's subdued tones greatly influenced both of the Matthews and led Arthur especially to perfect a Northern Californian version of arts and crafts painting, which we call tonalism. Tonalism became the dominant style in the early 1900s for all the painters associated with this period in San Francisco. Those subdued tones, broad opaque surfaces, mirroring the colors of the Bay Area landscape. And here we have a portrait that he did of Lucia at about this time. And this painting by Lucia herself is a pastel which she did on sandpaper. So Lucia was always interested in texture and experimenting with different surfaces for her painting. And I think it's not at all like Arthur's works at the time. It also includes one of the decorative kinds of frames that they together would later make at their furniture shop, which we'll talk about in a minute. So this is the kind of work she was doing at about the time they went off to Europe. But what we see with the Matthews is an example of the dilemma for the famous artist couple. And I include here, I'm reading here from the opening sentences of the section on Lucia in the Major Matthews catalog. And I quote, Lucia Kleinhans Matthews was accorded sparse recognition during her lifetime for her laudable reputation as an artist, and her work, compared with that of her more celebrated husband, Arthur, was barely noticed. So there we have it. In 1898, the couple did the grand tour of Europe, first to London, then on to Paris and Italy, then back to Paris. And it was at this time that Lucia studies at Whistler's Academy. Now, these paintings, and we're going to stop here in a minute and I'll ask your opinion, are very unlike, I think, Arthur's tonalist colors. And she's painting in a much blockier style. And I think that she may have seen, when they were on their trips, the artists of the Macchiaioli, which were Italian painters who had seen some Impressionism, but are actually developing their own idea of a different stylistic approach that's not academic, but is different. And this is what the kind of work that Matthews was doing at the time. So I wanted to stop here and ask your opinion. Why would I think that that Lucia was seeing these painters? What about her works look like that? So if you want to unmute and give me your opinions, do you think that's a possibility? Anybody? No? Okay. Upon her their return to California in 1899, Arthur went back to teaching, and his commission, and had all these commissions for large-scale murals. Remember that academic hierarchy of art, where history painting or large-scale genre painting are at the top of what's considered high art. And then landscape and still lifes and all of those other styles, other topics are considered lower down the scale. So he, as a man, is producing all of these mural paintings, a modern version of the old-fashioned historical painting, or the high hierarchy of art. Lucia went back to her own studio, where she makes some extraordinarily original paintings. This is her Sand Dunes and Beach Umbrella of 1899, extraordinarily verging on abstraction, probably painted in Monterey, with these contrasting shades, with bold, broad brushstrokes, and an elimination of details. And I thought again that she may have also in Europe had seen the Nobbies. This painting by Paul Serusier, who was considered one of the Nobby group, was often referred to as one of the first movements toward abstraction. Now, it's possible that Lucia was developing these stylistic ideas on her own, and then it's just coincidental, but I think it's very interesting to see how advanced. And she did not consider this just a study. She considered it a finished painting. It's very, very modern for 1899. At the same time, she begins her decorative work, as well as printmaking. And Arthur continued to create these gigantic murals for San Francisco buildings and was directly involved in the mural paintings at the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition that we talked about last week. This one is at the Crocker Museum. It was originally installed in a bank, and it shows an allegorical depiction of St. Francis blessing the modern city of San Francisco in the distance, with figures behind him, again, dressed in antique garb as personifications of the Western cultural tradition. And we see again the woman in white and wearing a kind of Grecian outfit. The landscape is meant to depict the hills of the Bay Area. The border this is where Lucia came in to the picture, was very typical of the decorative elements of California arts and crafts. And this was painted by Lucia, representing the fruits of California. When the 1906 earthquake destroyed the city and much of the Matthews work, as well as causing the demise of the school where Matthews was teaching, the School of Design, the Matthews opened a furniture and design workshop in hopes of participating in the rebuilding of the city upon their design principles. There were lots of ideas and ambitious and very interesting projects muted for the redevelopment or the rebuilding of San Francisco along city beautiful lines. None of that happened. To some extent, some of little bits of it were incorporated, but Lucia and Arthur were not really part of this. But in their shop, in keeping with Morrisonian precepts of aesthetic integration of all material aspects of living, Lucia made decorative items such as this chest with painted figures emulating Renaissance wedding chests, but with figures from antiquity. And remember, at this time, part of the image of California, especially around San Francisco, was that were all these allusions to the Mediterranean. Berkeley was called the Athens of the West, for example. So they're just the arts and crafts ideas that they employ and adopt are really part of this nurturing of a connection to past cultural life. Lucia she also made these decorative jars, which were very popular at the time. She saw to the hiring of the best European trained craftsmen to build the furniture in this workshop, to their designs, to the Matthews designs. And then she did most of the decorative work. They even built things like pianos and this writing desk, on which she did most of the painting. While Arthur gained enormous recognition and continued to do murals all over the area, Lucia, who continued to paint and was also running the business and making these decorative pieces, was largely forgotten as an artist in her own right until rediscovered in the 1970s, when there was such a revival of interest in California design. But it was mostly for her design work. It was only recently that people started really appreciating and looking at her painting. While the Matthews visited the Monterey art community often, and Arthur was part of the group that established that art gallery at the Hotel Del Monte in Monterey, but they were never permanent residents there. But I wanted to include finally two of Lucia's paintings done on the peninsula. The one on the right is probably from about 1910. And then one of her last watercolors in 1944. And these show her great skill as a landscape painter. And this brings us to the women whose art is most closely associated with the artist communities in the Monterey Peninsula. Mary Danielle Morgan, one of the many women who used an initial for her first name, going by the name M. Danielle Morgan for her artistic career. We talked a little bit about her last week. She was a native San Franciscan. She grew up in Oakland. She studied briefly with William Keith and then with Arthur Matthews at the School of Design. She came to Carmel in 1903, very early, and was the first woman to exhibit art at the Hotel del Monte Gallery, the site of so many events of the Carmel and Monterey community. And that's the merging there of high society among the guests at the hotel and the bohemian artists who came to exhibit their works in the gallery. She also exhibited at the PPIE and received a medal. Morgan never married. She never studied in the East, nor did she go to Europe. But she was instrumental in establishing the Carmel Art Association in the 1920s, which in some form or another is a fixture to this day. And I include her here because of her single beloved subject, which was the Monterey cypresses and the landscape of the coast. Because of this very specific identification with the peninsula, her art seems to be more enduring than others who were more lauded at the time. Still, she was described in 1928 in Scribner's magazine as one of the foremost women artists of the country. I see that I do have some questions here, so let me see what I didn't look here. Okay. Oh, it says that you can't unmute yourselves. Oh dear. Okay. All right. So she was an unusual one in that she really contributed, Morgan really contributed to the kind of administration of all of the cultural groups in Carmel. As we saw last week, she was director of the Carmel Art School in the 1920s as well. And these kinds of paintings of Monterey, of the cypresses and Point Lobos, are still being painted today by others. The next few artists with strong connections to Monterey and Carmel are examples of those who did study abroad, bringing back to California what were then considered extremely progressive and modernist styles. Mary Brady came from Ireland to California in 1880. She was the first California woman artist to spend significant amounts of time in Giverny, France, where she both studied and modeled for fellow American artists. And of course, Giverny is where Monet was in residence for quite a long time. When she came back, Brady became a longtime resident of Carmel, and she was one of the first in the 1890s to settle there. After leaving Giverny, she set up her home and studio in Monterey, so in the late 1890s already, where she painted the area's dramatic landscape in a loose style informed by her exposure to French Impressionism. She exhibited this painting, Sand Dunes, in Monterey, at the Society of American Artists in New York, the year it was completed, so in 1895. While receiving good reviews in Eastern papers, a conservative California critic gives us a good idea of what the objections to this modern painting were. He mocked her outre style, declaring it, quote, is entirely without drawing and resembles nothing so much as a disturbed mass of cotton batting. So the conservative art critics were just not yet able to accept the stylistic ideas of Impressionism even. They were still looking for that graphic solidity and control of the image with all of the tricks of chiaroscuro and three-dimensionality. And if you look at Brady's painting compared to the Monet, you can see what she was absorbing when she was in France. Okay, Brady's close friend that she'd known since their school days in San Francisco was Evelyn McCormick, and she was another mainstay of the Monterey colony, and one who also traveled to Giverny when Monet was still in residence in the 1890s. A true bohemian free spirit, she was associated with the peninsula's art life for 50 years. She was born in Placerville, California, of Irish parents. She attended San Francisco's California School of Design, where she received a good basic art education and met all of those other women artists that she would know in Monterey. And it was at the school that McCormick fell in love with Guy Rose, an artist who became a leading light in Southern California's art world. And in 1889, McCormick followed Rose to France, an adventurous and scandalously liberating experience for a young woman of the day. She first worked at the Académie Julienne, where so many of these other American artists went, where she joined then a group there of California girls, as they were called. Along with Mary Brady and Rose, she went to Giverny in 1890, rather than the more established landscape painting site of Barbizon. So some of the more conservative artists were still going to Barbizon, which had, of course, been one of the first plein air art locations in France, but that was in the 1840s, 1850s. So they were much darker tones at the time. So they were more interested in going to Giverny, which was considered much more modern. And in 1891, McCormick had her work, this one, A Garden in Giverny, accepted in the prestigious Salon in Paris, a significant honor for an American woman. And from Monet's work, as we can see here and in this painting of the cactus gardens back at Hotel Del Monte, she learned to eliminate black from her palette. While considered impressionist by California standards, she never lost the structural solidity of her painting. She returned to California in that summer, her romance with Rose over, and settled in Monterey. So she was one of the earliest women to set up an art studio there, along with Brady as well. Her garden painting, the same one that she'd shown in France, was one of the few women's works which were shown at the 1893 Chicago Exposition. And she painted the cactus garden at the Hotel Del Monte as an exotic garden display. Remember, at the time, this was considered quite exotic to show anything like cactus in a garden. And that was exhibited at the Midwinter International Exposition in 1894. She painted then with this impressionist palette, but with an underlying solidity that would mark all of her subsequent painting. And here she is at a much later date. Outgoing McCormick was in the thick of Monterey's cultural life. In 1895, she had a child out of wedlock, which she gave up for adoption. Nobody knows who the father was. She dressed comfortably, sometimes in Western-style clothing, with a low-brimmed cowboy hat. She also socialized with the male artists who lived nearby and shared in the shenanigans of George Sterling and Carmel's Bohemians. Charles Rollo Peters, who was one of the male artists of the group, referred to McCormick as, quote, the grandest person who ever lived. McCormick's later work, for which she gained significant recognition, focused on the old Spanish buildings of Monterey, characteristically in this linear style of hers. Whoop, there we go. In the Depression, she was commissioned by the WPA to produce images of old Monterey buildings, one of her favorite subjects. She lived in Monterey in the old Customs House and then in the Pacific Hotel in town, and was passionate at a very early time about historical preservation. So she was a fixture in the Monterey artistic scene for quite a while. Another of the exuberantly independent women artists associated with Monterey and Carmel was Euphemia Charlton Fortune, known to her friends as Effie. She always signed her works E. Charlton Fortune, creating a genderless signature. She was born in Sausalito of a Scottish family who retained ties with their homeland, and Effie was sent to Scotland in her childhood and gained early training at a traditional art school in London. She returned to San Francisco in 1905 and continued art study again with Arthur Matthews. She was an early proponent of Matthews' decorative style with those muted colors, etc. But when the earthquake happened, she lost all of her art and the home she shared with her mother. The family relocated to New York City, where Fortune studied with William Merritt Chase at the Art Students League. And then she went to Paris, where she absorbed the art of the Impressionists and post-Impressionists. And this is interesting. When she was in Paris, she also saw Cubist and Futurist works. But as with most other Californian artists in Europe at the time, these avant-garde directions were, for her, just too big a leap to absorb or understand. And if we look at the paintings that she makes when she gets back from Paris, these were considered very modern at the time for California. She came back in 1910, ended up in Carmel soon after, where she would establish a studio and become a permanent resident of the colony. She was a very familiar, eccentric figure. She always wore a tan corduroy suit and buckle shoes. And I think the corduroy suit was actually pants, and she was known for riding her bike through town with all of her painting equipment. She devised some kind of contraption where she could put her easel and all of her paints onto the bicycle at the front. She was known as one of the members of the informal artistic community in Monterey, and could be seen, as one writer put it, on any given day in her trademark corduroy suit, cycling through the pines. Now, she had a cleft palate, and the story goes, and this is an interesting social commentary on things at the time. She was said to have said that she wasn't going to get married because she had a cleft palate and she didn't want to pass that on. But of course, she had a lifelong woman companion, and Scott Shields, who is the curator at the Crocker Art Museum, who's really responsible for most of the Californian art that's at the Crocker Museum, was able once to meet her niece when she was very old, and she asked her, he just asked her point blank, could you please give me the story of the situation for Fortune and her partner? Were they lesbians? And the niece said, yes, I think they probably were. So just an example, though, of the kinds of stories and legends that have to be made up at that time. And of course, in Monterey at the time, it was no problem at all. They really nurtured and encouraged all kinds of alternate behaviors and alternate relationships. Fortune was instrumental in having Merritt Chase come to Carmel with his school in 1914, and was the first artist to ask permission to paint on the grounds of the PPIE in 1915. And this is one of her paintings done at that time. And it was recently sold for $395,000. So she is gaining some recognition. She sent 7 paintings to be exhibited at the PPIE, and she won a silver medal there as well. She went again to Europe in the 1920s, painting always in nature, exhibiting in several places, and spending a long period at one of the art communities in the UK at St. Ives, and also in Saint-Tropez in France. And it's hard to believe now, but these colorful yet fairly tame paintings were considered quite avant-garde by California standards of the day. And can anybody tell me why these would be considered so modern for the time? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? No? Okay. Now, the artwork that she was doing in the 20s, by the time she got back to Monterey in 1927, she learned to drive very badly, and she christened her car Blasphemia. I love that. But by this time, her paintings were beginning to receive negative reviews. So those paintings, which in the 1910s had seemed so modern, were now considered to be not modern enough. Still attached to narrative. She was always interested in atmospheric elements, the water and the relationship of land and water and natural elements. She also seemed to always be in ports. She liked to paint boats and ocean as well. She remained nonetheless committed to her style, her plein air style, but she also began about this time to paint liturgical scenes for churches. She was never a radical modernist, for her colorful style and exuberant character marked her as an important presence among Monterey and Carmel artists of the time. And she also was a well-known teacher to younger artists coming to Carmel. Now, the peninsula is a good place to begin talking about the amazing Bruton sisters, Margaret, Esther, and Helen. This photo was by their good friend, Imogen Cunningham, and they're seated here in front of Esther's native-inspired gilt screens. Some of you may have already learned about them through the devoted efforts of one librarian, Wendy Van Wyck Good. I sent you a link to her talk, which was done for another Ollie group, who devoted many years to recovering the legacy of the Brutons. She's written the book, The Bruton Sisters, this YouTube lectures, and she has her own blog as well, just devoted to the Bruton sisters. Now, the Bruton family lived in California. It lived in Alameda, California. They grew up affluent. Their father was the West Coast agent for a tobacco company. Very early on, they visited Monterey frequently, where the sisters would eventually settle in the 1920s. All three girls studied art from childhood, encouraged by their mother. They turned their family home's attic into an enormous studio. They first studied in San Francisco, then in New York City, and in 1925 went together to Europe. They were all tremendously adventurous. Esther, along with another woman friend, went to Tahiti in 1924, which was very unheard of for two women escorted to go to the South Pacific. All three and their mother went to Taos and Santa Fe in the 1920s. They were tremendously experimental in their art, and they were up for a good time. None of them had children. Only Esther married late in life. They often worked together and were fiercely loyal to each other, but independent as well. They often wore pants, a very daring thing to do in the 1930s, and seem to have been supremely self-confident, filled with energy and a sense of having fun in their creativity. And you will note that money never seems to have been any kind of object. There never seems to be any indication that they had to worry about that aspect of life, unlike so many other artists. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Bretones were very well known in California and throughout the United States, and they even gained an international following. And so here I'm only going to give a mere sampling of the many directions their artistic talents take them. The first one was the oldest daughter, Margaret, first concentrated on painting after her studies in New York and then in Monterey. She came to Monterey in 1921. And this is a picture from 1920. And by 1927, the portrait of her father, you can see the effects of her study back east and in Europe, in which she's obviously been looking at Cézanne and others of that era, where she starts to break it up into these faceted kinds of forms to create the feeling of illumination. And the earlier one of her mother is much more in an impressionist style. Her painting here of Barnes in 1925, this is after she has moved to Monterey, and shows the stylistic connections to her Monterey teacher, Armin Hansen, always with these broad areas of color and a focus on skies and clouds and reflections against water. That was what Armin Hansen was known for. Helen, the youngest sister, joined Margaret in Monterey in the early 1920s when she returned from her New York studies. And they built a small house together on Cass Street. Helen made woodcuts and other prints, humorous ones as well. And together they gave lots of parties. They provided food for artists' events and were very involved in the Monterey artistic community. But early on, Helen seemed to have been more interested in kind of commercial projects or large-scale architectural projects. In 1929, she went to Los Angeles and worked for the famous tile makers Gladding McBean. She was hired as the only woman in the company to produce mosaics for USC's Huss Library of Philosophy. She convinced the authorities there. These were only supposed to be plaques in honor of the ancient scholars, but she insisted that they include Emerson among the ancients. So the figure of Emerson is there because of Helen. They are still there in C2. Now, the middle sister, Esther, the only one who married eventually, was particularly intrigued with experimental techniques such as gilt surfaces, as in her screens made in 1929 after the sisters' time in Taos. And it's hard to see here, but this background is made out of gilt, out of flakes of gold placed on the background. And the surface of this screen, or the subject of this screen, is based on Native American designs that they saw when they were in Taos. As one friend, they all had, the Bruton sisters after this time had an exhibition in San Francisco in the early 1930s. Esther had, as one friend and fellow artist noted, an extraordinarily elastic mind. But she and the others were also up for fun, and they were an integral part of the San Francisco artist community. And that's why I include here this wonderful photograph when she, along with another artist, Victor Arnautoff, were king and queen of the Artists' Ball in 1936. And the theme seems to have been Asian art or Cambodian art, I think. The inclusion here of fellow artist and friend Victor Arnautoff brings up another interesting point about the Bruton sisters. He was a Russian artist who worked on many murals, including at the Coit Tower. He was a communist, or considered to be a communist, by the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 1950s, and was deported. But the Brutons, even though this atmosphere in 1930s San Francisco was very politicized, they never were the least bit interested in anything political, despite this atmosphere. And they were just friends with everyone there. But the work that she had done with these kind of gilt frames, and through the information, the knowledge of the exhibition, led to Esther's commission to design the murals for the Art Deco era Cirque Room of the fashionable Fairmont Hotel, one of the first bars to open after the repeal of Prohibition. It was such a hit that the bar named a drink after her, the Eckie. I haven't found the recipe for that cocktail yet. But again, you see here that we're not sure how they came up with the subject, she and the architect together, of the circus. But again, she's using these layers of gold flake adhering to the surface. She had hired some assistants, and she wasn't happy with how they did it. So she had her sister Margaret come in, and they did this often. They would work together on different projects. It has now been, the Cirque Room has now been renovated, and it's open again, and this is what it looks like now. Are some of you having trouble getting in? I'm noticing some people seem to be. Yes, somebody asked if they knew Georgia O'Keeffe. Yes, they did. They knew of the whole Stieglitz group back east, and did have some interaction with them as well. The sisters were actively involved in WPA projects, despite the fact that they didn't need the money. Supposedly, the funding for the WPA projects, or the federal arts projects, were based upon need, but that seems to have been loosely applied to some of the artists that they wanted to have work on it. Helen, who then recruited her sisters as assistants, was commissioned to make the murals for the Mothers Building at the San Francisco Zoo. And they chose as their medium here mosaics, not the large tiles that Helen had used at USC, but old-fashioned small tiles, as in ancient mosaics. And this was also their medium for their next WPA commission. And their subject, they were able to choose their subjects. So this was children and their animals, friends. And they had another mural on the other side, another mosaic that was of St. Francis. They were also commissioned then to work on another WPA project, murals for the side panels of the old art building on the Berkeley campus. And these have been restored just recently. And again, they were able to choose their topics, and they chose as their subject sculpture and dance, and placed it in this kind of antique setting. The Brutones' fame and professionalism came to fruition in their commission for the Golden Gate Exposition on Treasure Island in 1939. They were awarded an astonishing $20,000, an enormous sum at the time, to create the main 8,000-foot frieze at the fair on Treasure Island. The theme was Peace, or Pacifica, a poignant choice in the year marking the beginning of World War II. All three of the Brutones continued working in various mediums and with commercial success into the 1950s and 60s, sometimes together, sometimes separately, and never worried about their legacy, for as they said, they were having too much fun. And it's interesting that after working on this enormous frieze, this enormous project with other artists as well, but they did all of the design and most of the actual creation of the work. This piece was just destroyed at the end of the fair, and they really didn't mind. They didn't care. They just really were not interested. And they just went on to tremendous other projects, most of them for things like ships. They were putting murals in famous ship liners, yachts, and other projects. And they got into lots of inlay work and painting and all of these things. So a very interesting group. This next artist is one who interests me deeply, and who deserves to have more recognition than she has yet received. And this is Anne Millet Bremer. The photo here is by Dorothea Lange, which reminds us that at this time in the late 1910s and early 1920s, the famous documentary photographer Dorothea Lange worked as a portrait photographer in San Francisco. This image, the painting that I have up here from 1917, shows the style that was considered very masculine and progressive at the time. She was considered the most progressive artist in San Francisco at this time. She was born in San Francisco into one of the leading families of the city's Jewish community. And the Jewish community in San Francisco is central to much of the city's cultural development. We remember that the Steins, Gertrude Stein, was from Oakland, about which she said there is no there. But her brother, Michael, is the one who made the big collections of Matisse, Picasso, and other very modern artists. In 1889, Bremer began her art studies in the city, again, first under the tutelage of Arthur Matthews, and then she studied in Berkeley. She served as president of the Sketch Club in the 1900s, during which she organized what might be the most critically acclaimed women's exhibition to that date in February of 1906. Now, as we all know, in April of 1906, the earthquake happened, and Bremer at that time was instrumental in leading the artists through the fallout of the earthquake that followed, when the earthquake happened. She even provided, she was able to find an old building, which she turned into workspaces and living spaces for artists, became known as the studio building. She lived there, and she allowed other artists to live there too. She served as the president of the Sketch Club in the 1900s. I already said that, sorry. In 1910 and 11, she studied in Paris with André Lotte, who had been one of the Fauvists, and also at those predictable academies, the Académie Julienne and the others, and even exhibited at the Salon d'Automne in Paris. On the way back from Europe, she spent some time in New York City around the Stieglitz crowd, and her painting style underwent a dramatic change from the moody, tonalist portraits and landscapes she had emulated in California to a gestural abstraction akin to Cézanne, Matisse, and Van Gogh. So she had changed from this style, which she created a mural for a hospital in San Francisco right before she went to Europe. And you can see that the tonalities there are very much those muted ones like Matthew's. And this is the kind of painting that she was making when she came back from Europe and from New York. New York was very, that experience with the modern New York artists around the Stieglitz circle was very important. When she returned to San Francisco, she remained active as an artist and a teacher in the city and was considered one of the most progressive artists at the time. Now, I find that you can see in Ravenlocks, which is at Mills College Art Gallery, art collection. You can see that this is very almost like she's actually seen some Fauvist works with these kinds of almost pointillist dot works and broad areas of color. And this one, really, to me, is what the Spanish lady is quite reminiscent with this green nose of Matisse, of the famous green nose, much more colorful. And this painting, Henri, the Matisse woman with a hat, is in the San Francisco Museum. Now, it's likely that through her family's prominence in the Jewish community, Bremer knew the Steins, who, contrary to popular belief, did maintain residences in Oakland, and Michael Stein brought some of his most radical paintings back to the city, including this one, Woman with a Hat. In a letter, Bremer speaks of having seen a Matisse at the home of a friend. This must have been Michael Stein's family, and it may have been this very painting. Bremer was a socialist. She was friends with Jack London, George Sterling, and radical thinkers in the city. She was an agitator for artists and women's rights, and she exemplified, as one critic writes, the evolving alliance between feminism and modernism. Marsden Hartley, who was one of the artists from Stieglitz's group and who knew her in New York City, wrote that she was one of the 3 artists of real distinction that California produced. Spencer Mackey, who was the director of the California School of Fine Arts from 1919 to 1935, said that Bremer, it took real courage for her to display the kind of paintings that she did when she returned to the city. Bremer was the one who was considered to have a man's hand. And I'm reading from a WPA research file. Anne Bremer was noted for the strength of her painting and is called by critics the woman painter with a man's touch. She escaped traditional prettiness by seeing true values in her subject and its illumination. Decidedly the intelligent, cultured woman who was also awake to the artist's place in a difficult world and helped promote many of her artist friends, dancers, writers, and musicians. Sadly, she died of leukemia in 1923, only 55, and spent her last 2 years writing poetry rather than painting. She too had visited Monterey often and painted and exhibited there. She was actually better known to most for her landscapes than for her portraits. And if you go to the art museum in San Francisco now, you will find this Anne Bremer next to the display of the Matisse painting. And this happens because of her friend and important figure, Albert Bender. And we have to talk a bit about Bender in relation to all of these artists. Bender was Anne Bremmer's cousin. He was Irish. The family brought him to San Francisco in 1880. He became immensely wealthy in the insurance business, then devoted his life to art collecting and art patronage. Spencer and Constance Mackey were neighbors of both Anne Bremmer and Albert Bender in that old building that Anne had converted into artist living and workspaces. Bender and Bremmer lived in adjoining apartments, and Mackey writes that they were very much in love, but they were first cousins, and in those days that was absolutely taboo. So although their close friends knew them as a loving couple, to others they were an artist and an insurance broker art patron whose names were seldom linked. Bender becomes the most active in buying and donating contemporary art after Anne's death in 1923. He created a Mills College scholarship in her honor, a fountain named for her, and the library at the San Francisco Art Institute, the now defunct San Francisco Art Institute, is named for her. He often told people it was her involvement in the art world that led him to become an art patron. He, in turn, almost single-handedly developed the collection of the San Francisco Museum of Art, now the SF MoMA. In its early years, he donated some 1,100 artworks when the museum first opened. He became the philanthropist of San Francisco, not only in art, but in symphonies and everything else. So had it not been for this taboo relationship between the two cousins with the same initials, Albert M. Bender and Anne M. Bremmer, San Francisco might not have the Museum of Modern Art it has today. Now, I would so like to talk a bit about the women who worked on the WPA projects of the 1930s, but I'm running out of time, and I have one more intriguing artist to consider. Suffice it to say that, as we have seen in the WPA projects on which the Brutones worked, women artists were actively employed in these public art projects throughout California. And we see here Helen Bruton working in front of the WPA poster. There were exhibitions, this one in Boston, of the women painters working on the WPA. And this is Helen Forbes and Dorothy Punchinelli working on a mural for the Mothers Building, that one that the Brutones worked on, the mosaics as well. And as we remember, WPA, there were several projects through the Federal Art Project Program or through the Treasury Department as well. This is the only time that the American government has actually paid artists to do public artworks. And this one is Maxine Albro. At the time they built the Coit Tower, was also part of a WPA project, the building of the tower. And Maxine Albro is one of the many artists who worked on the murals there. Hers is the one of California agriculture with all of these apricots. She's here working on a mosaic for the state college, I think, or for the community college. And I was just in San Francisco on Monday and went to Coit Tower. And it's a wonderful experience. I hope you all go, because you get this really immediate feeling of what it was like to be in this exciting project. I didn't realize the Coit Tower was one of the very first of the WPA projects to be implemented. And there are several artists murals throughout the whole tower, but this is Maxine Albros, and you can see here details Here, this is the NRA when the NRA stood for something more positive than it does now. This is the National Recovery Act, which was the organization under which these programs were. And she has signed it here, Maxine Albro. I just was reading that one of the things that people always point out about the WPA projects is it wasn't a program to advance modern stylistic art directions for any of these artists. It was very clear that you had to do kind of almost social realism in your painting, but it provided work for the artists, and that was the important thing in the Depression, and they were all immensely grateful for it. And finally, I want to consider one of the many multicultural figures prominent and successful on the San Francisco art scene in the 1920s and 30s, and that is the Japanese-American artist Miki Hayakawa. I hope that many of you will watch Shin-Pu Wang's presentation on YouTube, as he's the one who's really rediscovered her as an interesting Asian-American artist. She was born in Japan in 1899 and came to California with her family when she was 9. Despite the objections of her family, she was determined to become an artist. She received scholarships to study at the School of the California Guild of Arts and Crafts, which was then located in Berkeley, in 1922, and then at the School of Fine Arts in San Francisco for the next several years. While at the School of Fine Arts, which she attended intermittently until 1929, she became close friends with classmates Yun Ji, a Chinese-American artist, and George Matsusaburo Hebe and his wife, Japanese-American artists, who served as her mentors. And like Ji, who had studied in Paris, her paintings from the 1920s show the influence of Cubist studies and modern color. You see this one in her Homage to Cézanne from 1925, and in this one, From My Window, in which you see this faceted, luminous kind of breakup of the surfaces of color. And this is the one that's currently on exhibit as part of the Dykstra collection at the Huntington Library. And this was painted at the time that Coit Tower, there it is in the background, had just opened, had just been built. So it captures a specific time and place. She painted this view from her home on the in the northeastern corner of San Francisco, just a few blocks from Telegraph Hill. And it's very reminiscent of, it's very, very similar to the kinds of work that she's doing at the time. She was very much a part of the community and was able to exhibit at the opening of the San Francisco Art Institute, or not the Art Institute, the American Art, when was it? Oh, I can't remember now. Anyway, she was very involved with the community. She was able to exhibit at all of the various organizations, including she had a major exhibition at the Japanese American Center, the Golden Gate Institute in San Francisco. She had 150 works shown there in 1935. So she was very much a part of the community. Then came the bombing of Pearl Harbor and America's entry into the war, and lamentably for all Japanese Americans, Executive Order 966, which incarcerated some 100,000 Japanese Americans in concentration camps throughout the country. Hayakawa's friends, the Hebes, were sent to Topaz, Utah, and other Asian artists ended up incarcerated or in other places. And here's where Hayakawa's story gets interesting and brings us back to Albert Bender. While her parents were sent to the camp in Topaz, Hayakawa receives at the time, this is 1942, 1943, one of Bender's artist grants through the auspices of the San Francisco Art Institute. While it is unclear how she manages to escape, as it were, she ends up at that time in New Mexico, where throughout the war and after, she's part of the artist scene in Santa Fe. She apparently does not appear on any of the scrupulously kept records by the US government of those who were incarcerated. And I think it's because she got this grant from Bender. She was able to just disappear, or just to go off to New Mexico. But we don't really know how or why that happened. What interests me is that she's able throughout the war to continue to exhibit. She's part of the whole artist scene in Santa Fe, and you can see her here in this picture. This photo in 1943, I think, with several of the artists in Santa Fe. This is Albert Morang. This is John Marin, and she marries Preston McCrossan, another artist there, and continues to paint and exhibit until her death from cancer in 1953. As the Japanese American Encyclopedia Densho writes, her work has experienced a public resurgence, largely due to the inclusion of a single painting, Portrait of a Negro, from 1926. In 2013, this piece was included in an exhibition designed to introduce American art and identity to new audiences in Australia. Then, in the summer of 2014, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art included the painting in their submission to the Art Everywhere campaign, which asked 5 US art museums to select digital works from their collections to be placed on a website. So I conclude with this example of San Francisco's diverse artistic milieu before World War II. One of so many that, like all the other women presented here, were in their time well received, were recognized, introducing modernist styles to California, and who were subsequently forgotten, obscured, made invisible, unsung until now. So that's it. And I will end that. Okay, and I'm going to stop share. And I can see you all. So can I ask you all to unmute? And we can have some conversations. Can everybody do that or not? Unmute all. No, can't do that?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, you can. Okay.
Left-hand corner.
Yeah, just go down to that corner and unmute.
Just press it.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
So, do we have any questions, or shall I go through the list here? No.
I finally got the hang of it. I'm wondering what the comparison would be to male artists of the period in California who were also very prominent. Did they also, was it a stylistic thing where they just sank out of recognition, or was it mainly gender?
What's interesting is that the women were on an equal plane with the male artists, at least in Monterey, and many of them were more advanced than some of the male artists. The obscurity, well, no, you're right, because the male artists of the time have not received much recognition either. But the women who were well known, like the Bruton sisters, I don't know, had you ever heard of them? Yeah, and they were very well known in California at the time. So I think it's the period itself that once abstract expressionism comes along, and of course there's this idea that one, being Californian, you're not significant. And the other, of course, is that it's American, and there was still this idea that real art came from Europe. I think that's probably part of it, don't you think? I think that's part of it. Okay. What does it say? Oh, the host is not allowing. Oh, no, I didn't do that. Okay, let me see if I can figure it out. I knew this was going to happen. Some of you are able to unmute though. No?
Mhm.
Yeah? Okay. So who can't unmute? Let me see. Chat. Okay, Barbara, let me see. I'll try to get you to unmute. Ask to unmute. Okay. There, you should be able to. Did you do it? Were you able
Yes.
to? Okay. All right.
But Erica, that's a setting in your Zoom settings that you can change at some other time at your leisure.
But I thought
Unless-
I did. Okay. Any other questions? Let's see what I've got.
Check.
Carolyn?
Oh, no, I was just pointing to the chat room.
Okay. Oh, the characteristics of a masculine hand. That's a good question. I think if it were at that point, they were anybody who wasn't painting the prescribed ideas of what women should be painting, which would be in an academic style, babies, children, mothers, maybe flowers. Anybody who was painting in a very loose post-impressionist style, anything with lots of open color, that would be considered a masculine hand. I think that's what I understand, because this is at that point where we talked about, like last time, where women were still considered, if they wanted to be artists, they were supposed to have particular kinds of styles that they were allowed to paint in, you know, as long as they weren't moving into the high art categories, which men were supposed to be best at, then they would have a masculine hand. Does that make sense? Is that Cindy? Cindy, can you unmute? No? There you go. You should be able to. No?
Oh, thank you.
There you go. Okay. Did you want to ask that question, or does that
Oh, I
answer?
did ask that. Oh, I
Okay.
did.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, didn't American artists come into their own with, yes, abstract expressionism, as I said last time, was really the movement, which, first of all, is taken over by the men. There are some women who do it, but that's the one that's seen as, okay, this is America. This is American art. This is masculine and gestural, and it was taken up by the U.S. government even and presented as the style of freedom, liberty and freedom and all of that. Meanwhile, Jackson Pollock and everyone is back there at the Cedar Inn drinking themselves to death. Why so many of the artists were it was hard for the women artists and everything had to be abstract at that time. So, and a lot of women artists of that period, even in the 1950s, wanted to remain in kind of representational art. So they were obscured at that point too. But it is interesting that this whole period of the early 1900s up to the World War II is this kind of transitional period from when women are allowed to become to join this the artistic community, but there's still questions of where they fit and how that would work. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you next week, and we'll do Southern California then.
Okay,
Thanks a lot.
okay.
Bye.
Bye.